Okay, so basically, I've mentioned it already, but I'll just quickly say it again. We are entering the last phase of the course, which is called recalibrating human settlements, with this idea of, now that we've kind of traced what the human settlements agenda over time has tried to be about, what can we say about how this agenda has evolved in relation to how our contemporary life looks like, contemporary questions of kind of injustice and inequality and so forth. So what does it mean to look at human settlements today? Is it even the right lens to have, in a certain sense? And that's, we have 3 lectures to do that. And it's going to be through the bias, through an angle, which is related to 3 key concepts. Because these concepts, despite the fact that there's high recognition, for example, that informality is an insufficient kind of term to work with, it's very hard to eradicate from a number of reports, ways of thinking, planning, and institutional frameworks, and so forth. They remain very powerful. And similarly, sustainability has been, at one point, it's come with a lot of promises as a kind of correction of that hardcore, economically oriented development. And I think you all know that the word sustainability by now is kind of, every other word is sustainable. Everybody claims to be sustainable in what they do. So also, how do we deal with that, and what can we say about sustainability? And likewise, with the kind of crises that are just cascading, there is this sense that emergency is a kind of constant state under which we are under. And then that allows for a number of kind of things to happen within design and planning kind of apparatuses. Because in the name of emergency, very often you can operate differently. It's a kind of momentum. At the same time, if it's an extended sense of emergency, one wonders how kind of exceptional that is. So these kind of challenges are going to be unpacked. Today, it's going to be unpacked through a kind of overview of the debate, and I will be doing that. But the next 2 sessions, we're actually going to have, on the one hand, a practitioner who's also an alumni, Sebastián Oviedo. He's also a co-founder of an important practice called Ataraya, and he'll be showing his work. So he's not going to tackle kind of sustainability firsthand, but we are going to do it in the debate, and then we're going to try and see what we can say about that also in relation to his practice. And on the other hand, with emergency, we will have Nurhan Aboujidi, who's also an alumni of the program, now teaching at Zuid University in the Netherlands, who's been for a long time working on herbicide in Palestine, and who will bring that topic to the fore. And we will therefore have actually a longer session up to 1 o'clock in that case, because we are going to open it up, in fact, to a larger audience as well. And so that's a bit the kind of setup. And every time in the first hour, we will first have the debate around the text and the project. So that will be a bit the kickoff, like warming up in relation to the concept, and then having an intervention. And so I think a lot of things have already been anticipated on informality already in the discussions we were having. But it is a very, very pervasive kind of term and concept. And it's gathered in the last also 2 decades, really a lot of debate, which has been fundamental, also to start connecting what we thought were very distinct environments. And so thinking much more relationally, let's say, about the term. And the kind of debates have been around the fact that informality is not geographically, it's not in a certain area, but it's actually existing everywhere. We have to see how, and then a lot of other things that we will try and look at in the course of the next kind of section. And one of the things that has appeared already in this kind of 20 years of debate, almost actually 25 by now, is the whole idea also of scale and size. So if you remember also in the timeline that actually Praveen and Neha had, there was this whole initiation around the informal city, and then also the endless city and the city of slums, and so forth and so forth. And there's really this moment in time when there's a recognition that large amounts of territories are being produced informally. That means that there's this preoccupation also with the scale of it. It's like the quantity of it, something that's like so significant that we are actually moving towards a mega, a mega everything, a mega city, a mega slum. Also very much in this kind of dichotomic or symmetrical opposition of mega city versus mega slum. And Rao, who's actually an important scholar on informality and slums more generally, says it's really at this moment in time, it becomes this kind of iconic geography, this mega city and this mega slum, that is kind of emblematic of a whole human condition. It's a moment in time where climate change is not yet, for example, a very spoken of term, and whereas informality and slum has really high prevalence on the agenda. And so you will see that many of the texts I refer to are really produced in the 2000-2020 period. So it's 2 decades of solid work by a number of really good scholars who have tried to understand a bit and come to terms with this kind of question. And one of them is Colin McFarlane, who has been writing quite a lot on the topic. He's a British geographer. And he's been editing books and writing articles. A lot of them, I must say, coming from South Asia. So there's a very large amount of scholars who are Indian, who are also related to the kind of subaltern theory group, who are preoccupied with this whole marginalization process, but not only, but they are definitely very present. And so Colin McFarlane, together with Michael Webble, they kind of co-edit a quite important book, and they write a piece on this formal-informal divide, where they basically say that this divide is actually, it's used instrumentally in a whole series of contexts. So focusing on the divide is a kind of political act. Creating and earmarking that divide is something that we have to be attentive to, and they say it's put to work in many different ways and in many different contexts. But they also think that there are 4 that we need to be attentive to, because they also have significance for urban processes and urban practices. And one of them is the fact that sometimes this divide is articulated as a spatial differentiation. We were talking about that before. Is it informal because it looks informal? Is it kind of spatially informal? And so they say, well, actually informality is often assumed to be territorialized, and it's specific to slum settlements. We forget, for example, when we visit a small village on the top of a hill in Italy, that it was completely informal as well, if we have to use these standards of operating, of spontaneous self-growth and so forth. Now it's glorified and celebrated by high-end tourism. So they are trying to make a point that there's a very now clear association when somebody says informal that you immediately think of slums. And and it touches upon their kind of presence within the margins of the city. They also say it's not just spatial, it can be treated as a kind of organizational form. So it's about this spontaneous, this kind of tacit knowledge, and it's about also unorganized, unregulated labor, and that's the kind of core question of how informal and formal are used and also separated. Also, in institutional practices, when they become a kind of governmental tool, it becomes a way to start organizing the city. There's this kind of divide, and so there's categories, and you find them in planning instruments. When an area is marked as informal, it has particular implications. It means institutions can operate in certain ways. And at the same time, quite importantly, their last point is on the negotiable value that informality often has. And the fact that it's not a kind of silo, but actually that there's a kind of fluidity of movement. And so people move between formal and informal kind of settings. And so these are important points that we'll kind of see recurring in many other also authors, and sometimes authors have focused on one of these particular points more specifically, but it really shows that they try to cover a bit comprehensively the way in which this divide has been articulated, instrumentalized, and mobilized. And so if we kind of continue this discussion, that informality basically means slum is a very, very common misconception that you'll actually find across cities. And so then it actually means that we often start finding, in association with informality, accounts of the slum. Slum as a kind of terrain, of habitation, of livelihood, but also of politics, of marginalization, and then also this kind of dystopic reading when informality seems so pervasive and slums were so mega that there are people like Mike Davis, for example, who are writing about a planet of slums, how we will end in this kind of dystopic, completely overruled by these informal kind of settings where the conditions of environments are kind of dire in terms of access to basic rights and so forth. And then a clear connection also that it's a worldwide phenomena. So we are talking about something that's happening everywhere. It's the planet of slums. It's slums of the world. It's not something that's just for a few. But this idea that they are happening everywhere becomes also interesting in the light of, if you actually start looking into this world of slums, you will find that they are cities that are very different from one another. So they might share a kind of condition that we can discuss also where it comes from, the kind of representation. But when you start looking into all these various slums, and these are actually photographs of famous slums across the world that you can find on the web, from also a kind of urban design and urban planning perspective, you understand that they come in different faces and different pieces and different sizes and different shapes. This is a Shaiman, for example, in Ghana. The previous one was in Bogota. Here you see Comuna 13, which is in Medellin, Colombia. Cases that we've already looked like, such as Dharavi, where we were trying also to look into the fact, and I think also Gita Mehta made it very clear that Dharavi can't really just be called and labeled as this homogeneous area of slumness. Kibera, we discussed the project this morning within this kind of settlement. This is an example from a quite well-known case in Caracas called Petare. Rocinha, very famous in Rio de Janeiro, also for slum tourism for quite a while now. And another case in Turkey. I will not pronounce it, but we have somebody here who can do that for us. So I will then ask you for the proper pronunciation. But so just a point about the fact that when we talk about a worldwide condition, we also have to understand that what comes with it is to try and be specific about what we're talking about, despite an apparent kind of shared condition. Because already just from this kind of set of images, we can see how diverse, just from a geographically kind of top-down view, these settlements are, density-wise, morphologically-wise, and probably, most, in fact, probably culturally and socially. So it's really something that at the same time we have to be aware of. But it's also very clear that there is this preoccupation with size, which connects mega cities to mega slums. And also connects it, in fact, to the fact that as cities grow, the proportion of people considered living in informal settlements is also growing. So the process is kind of intertwined, and therefore there should be a form of attention. And indeed, it's interesting to see how the top 10 megacities over time have evolved. Here you have 1950. 2010, there's already a significant shift. And by 2025, which is next year, depends on how you position yourself. So there's no clear-cut answer. Even on the definition of homelessness, there's nuances. So it's good to look at civil society organizations, the ones that are closer also to those who are homeless or have experienced homelessness, to understand how they frame it, because very often they frame it in favor of, securing rights for those who are experiencing this kind of phenomena. But it usually fits. It really depends where you are in the world as well. In general, it's really even hard sometimes to have proper data on homelessness. And there's a lot of people in a kind of fluctuating situation. So they try to now have nuances within that definition. Even in Europe, for example, they have like 4 categories that are helping to kind of nuance that definition. And so, together with megacities, this is the 2025 projection made quite a while ago of where the mega slums of the world, the kind of proportion of mega slums would be. You can see this kind of forecast, which is also placing Asia at the forefront of this particular condition. And so this is all the kind of big kind of data around slums and megacities, a bit in this idea of rising attention towards it, but also with a sense of preoccupation about it, and as something that needs to be kind of corrected. And it's particularly kind of evident also in how, for example, change in sub-Saharan Africa is being conceived, where with the highest urbanization rates, we also notice that there is, even in cities which were previously considered slumless, the rise of these kind of settlements. And in relation to this, it's very interesting to understand what has been said about this attention. So in relation to that particular moment in time, the kind of early 2000s, we see a reappearance of the word slum. It's like very, very present. And so it's interesting to see how slum has been defined, for example, by the Oxford Encyclopedic Dictionary. You can see that it's immediately described as something that's overcrowded, that's squalid, very poor, unfit for human inhabitation, kind of uninhabitable. The Cities Alliance, which is an extension of the World Bank, has defined slums as by what they don't have, so a sense of lack of something. So they don't have services, they don't have schools, they don't have places for community. And then there's been a UN expert group meeting, which has considered also an operational definition. And they talk more about a combination of elements, but again with a sense of inadequacy that is foregrounded. So there's inadequate access to safe water, there's inadequate access to sanitation, and there's also a poor quality as well as insecure residential status. So it starts kind of becoming more intersectional in the kind of things it puts together. But Alan Gilbert, who's somebody who's been working a lot in self-constructed settlements in Latin America, pointed out, and he had a critique, in fact, of this definition, because he says, well, actually, in defining a slum in this way, this is the counterpart of this, is actually to be very, very target-oriented. So it's actually to set quantitative targets against which progress can be measured, and they're also universal targets. So it's a bit the contradiction of we are sharing this preoccupation for a worldwide condition, but we're not taking into account the fact that there's a world of slums out there in the sense of their variety and their kind of also cultural embeddedness and so forth. And he says to calculate that baseline, they use deprivation. So they don't use other elements. They actually say that it's about minimal levels, and so there's a kind of slum line below which something can be then classified as unfit. So it's a particular lens that he is kind of foregrounding, and he is expressing also a kind of preoccupation with that. And the reason why he is against this kind of baseline definition is something that he then expands upon quite clearly. He says, first of all, standards differ. There was a question on standards before in the discussion. So what might be considered a slum in a certain context might not be considered a slum in another one. So what is considered also unfit if we consider that these are all social constructions, might actually vary from place to place and even from social class to social class. So we have a problem if we are setting universal standards. Also, even within these slums, also because they are mega slums, they are actually not homogeneous places. So by saying that Dharavi is uninhabitable, you're actually creating a problem for an area which is, on the other hand, characterized, as we've seen, by many different kinds of groups and morphologies and processes of transformation and so forth. And diversity is inherent, he says, to many. For example, many of these settlements, especially if they are older, because they've actually followed a kind of historical process of transformation, and even tenure is not a kind of fixed thing. So he says slum cannot be absolute, but it's a relative concept. So there's no way we can define it safely and in a universally acceptable way. Also, it's not been stable across time. In London, there were areas called slums. The whole kind of industrial revolution and the whole birth of urbanism, even as a discipline, is thought to have been risen because there were people living in slums. And the way they looked like, at least from the documentation we have, has nothing to do with a lot of the things we see called slums in other places. So it's very difficult, he thinks, to kind of to consider slum as kind of stable. But then at the same time, he says, if they are so relational, and if they are partially a physical and a social construct, how are we going to eliminate them? But on the other hand, this does not mean that there haven't been policies that have been really targeted for their elimination. One of the examples is the Slum-Free Cities Initiative by the Cities Alliance, which is this offshoot of the World Bank. They launched a whole campaign called Cities Without Slums, and it was with the UN Habitat, the World Bank. There were major other international associations, and there were 10 donor governments that took up the challenge to work in this direction. Again, in this whole idea of like managing the growth of slums and of cities, of mega cities where slums were taking place. And in the slum-free cities, you can see they have this kind of action plan, very clearly with a target: improve the lives of 100 million slum dwellers by 2020. And the kind of also discussion, as you can see, hundreds of millions of urban poor in the developing and transitional world have few options but to live in squalid, unsafe environments where they face multiple threats to their health and security. I think you can recognize the kind of tone that is at hand here. Never in any of these documents have we seen a positive description of slum, of any sense of agency in slum dwellers, and so forth and so forth. And that's also something that is then going to be, in fact, taken up. And you can see that this very important campaign is really at the tipping point between the 20th century and the 21st century, where in the early 2000s, we really have this scholarship that starts really digging into this question of informality. So it's not a coincidence. And so the Slum Upgrading Action Plan is about improvements, and it is about also trying to link local authorities and businesses and community groups and so forth. And they have a whole system, which of course I think nobody can actually be against in terms of what they aim to kind of do in terms of improving basic infrastructure, removing environmental hazards. I'm not going to read all of them, but they're all reasonable kind of targets. But what is at question here is the kind of framework and the kind of bias and the kind of angle that is being used to consider these targets as the way forward. This is what Gilbert is kind of also saying. How can we devise an upgrading plan if slums are unstable constructions, if they are very diverse? What is a target in this slum that might not be in the other one? We have to kind of understand this. And so in this target-oriented also definition of slums, we see that UN Habitat, indeed, they try to develop a household-level definition, which is basically linked then again on what is lacking. So if a household is linking improved water, improved sanitation, security of tenure, durability of housing, doesn't have enough living area, and they say, for example, not more than 2 people sharing the same room. What's a room? Very hard to kind of describe at this point across places. And it is, however, linked to these goals. So we know now, and we are still under this kind of frame, which also has been criticized, of trying to set universal goals that then national governments can kind of move towards. We are now under the Sustainable Development Goals. And at the time, it was the Millennium Development Goals, and those development goals, which were up to 2015, I believe, one of them was about environmental sustainability. And you can see that under that goal in Target 11, there was this idea of improving the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers by 2020. So this was the full kind of agenda. This is the accompaniment of it, where 5 dimensions of slum improvement linked to the LACs were actually then promoted. So safe water, sanitation, tenure, housing durability, and sufficient living area. And this is where also then we understand that there's critiques coming from scholars, researchers, practicing architects. We have on the one hand Marie Hutschmeyer, who says, actually we should maybe think of cities with slums. So we shouldn't eradicate the idea of informal settlements. We should consider this more as a matter of right to the city. We should understand how slums have come to be, what are called slums, how they've come to be in terms of wanting to access particular rights, particular opportunities, and because of extreme inequality, extreme injustice, have not been able to. And that shifts completely the way in which you then look at an informal settlement. Urban think tank, they say, well, actually you have to consider the kind of cultural aspects of informality as a kind of way of life that is actually interesting to kind of keep and understand, and again, shouldn't kind of be thrown away under this idea of improvement that is very also focusing on physical kind of characteristics and so forth. And this is how then we see how this has moved forward. So in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the present framework under which we are operating in terms of governments and the like, we have now Sustainable Development Goals we are expected to reach. Now, notoriously and historically, goals have never been met, but it's a kind of continuing system. And goal 11 is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And so by 2030, which is the next kind of temporal deadline, there's a whole series of targets. And it is also linked, in fact, to inclusive and sustainable urbanization. But it is also the first time where we see that actually slum is not used, actually. So they're talking in other terms, they're talking about adequate, safe, and affordable. They do have it in the first point. Sorry, I made a mistake. It's another framework that doesn't have it. So slums continue to be with us, despite the fact that there's been a long-standing critique. And so, again, adequate, safe, affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. There's no quantitative target in this general goal, but then there's 126 indicators that are expected to offer a frame for everyone who'd like to implement all this, where then you start having more specific targets. And so that's quite important to keep in mind. Slums kind of remain with us, just as much as other kind of terms. And so that takes us a bit more to this whole larger discussion of informality, which, as we saw, Rao says, informality equals slums in the mindset of most policy and kind of practitioners, but even just in kind of citizens worldwide. And so what you start seeing here is precisely what also then Colin McFarlane and Michael Webble had started talking about, this whole focus on the divide and how people use it has usually a bias that belongs to that. Like you can kind of associate it to one of those 4 points. And the African Center for Cities produced an interesting document on informality, in fact, in 2018, where they say, well, actually, it's used so much, informality, that we kind of assume that there's an understanding of this term. But actually, once you enter a study of informality in whatever context, you will see that it's super complex and super nuanced. So this general assumption, all of a sudden, this general understanding, all of a sudden kind of loses weight. And one of the kind of also, after their empirical study on informal, in fact, vending systems in also South Africa, they start saying there's many things that we have to look at when we look at informality. One of them is intersection. They say actually informality comes together seamlessly in people's lives. They're not thinking, oh, I'm doing something informal, oh, I'm doing something formal. It's a kind of continuum of practices and so forth. Also that it's quite ambiguous, and in this ambiguity it's actually linked to a number of survival possibilities, because the fact that some things, for example, are not subject to tax might mean that people can put just enough money aside to actually continue to stay put. So that ambiguity is quite important. So, they can't afford market prices, so that ambiguity is kind of critical. In fact, informality is responding to a demand very clearly in that regard. Agency is also something that is often not foregrounded when you talk about informality, and that, on the other hand, through their empirical studies, they have recognized. They say often when you start looking at what informality is constituted by, it's actually a whole series of innovative practices. We have to understand that it's a form of inventiveness. Not only, but it also has that component. At the same time, they say that it's a paradox. If you look at the informal street vending system in Ghana, for example, it's super organized and super structured. But because of the fact that it's not supposed to be on sidewalks, in streets, and so forth, it's usually considered informal. But all of these situations, at least in the case of Ghana, but also in the one that they are looking into, they are subject to super complex processes of social organization, management, and control. There's usually associations, there's actually payments coming across and so forth. There's a whole series of situations in that regard, not all positive in themselves, so no celebration either. And then also this whole question of entanglement, which is going back to this whole idea that actually they are informal and formal are not distinct phenomena. In fact, the informal is a product of the formal, because it's what the state sets up as being formal that produces the informal as something that is not formal, as the state has understood it and presented it. So that relationship needs to be understood. And that's what's interesting in the whole creation of the informal. It's not the same thing as saying they are kind of mutually entangled. Here, they are actually saying the informal is subordinate to a regulatory understanding of formal, which is a quite significant kind of statement in that regard. And so we're going to look at some of these contradictions, or at least we're going to try and break down informality in 5 ways that are also relevant to some of the practices that have emerged when designers and planners have had to deal with informality, which is, of course, a very small piece of a whole reasoning around informality. But some of the questions you were asking in the debate is, well, how can, practitioners do this? How can they formalize? And so forth. And so one of the things that informality has been also associated with, even in art, is that it's something without a form, without a kind of distinct and also stable form. Another way in which, another bias that's been very clearly put across is that informality is something that is out of law. It's unregulated, it's out of control, it doesn't fit, it's not compliant to the legal statement. One other bias is more this whole question of self-organization and entrepreneurialism. I think in both cases there was this idea that informal, in the both presentations and the debate, but surely in the one on Kibera, there was this idea that one of the assets that was present was entrepreneurship. And it's very often being described as one of the assets that actually slums have, that informal settlements have. There's a great possibility for entrepreneurship and so forth. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a whole set of works that are rather framing those in slums as subject to kind of super fundamental inequities and injustices, and therefore they are voiceless, they are marginalized, they have been dispossessed, they have no rights. So it's another kind of angle in that regard. And then the last one is a kind of focus on this adaptive transitional modality that informality brings with it. So this is not like, they are not fixed categories, just one moment, and then I'll take your question. There is porosity between them, but there are kind of 5 large domains we can consider when we look at informality. So I'm not saying that informality has no form. I'm saying that it's one of the angles that has been used to describe informality, and without form means that it hasn't been formally designed. There's no blueprint. Yeah. No, well, so these definitions there's no universal acceptance of these definitions. These are 5 ways of looking at informality that I have discerned from literature and projects. And all of them, I think, have a level of ambiguity and contradiction within them. So I'm not presenting any of them as the way to look at informality, but it's as if that's the particular angle that has been foregrounded by a particular set of people and practices that we can then kind of disagree with or agree to or kind of learn from or consider. But there has been a very strong understanding that informality does not have a form, and that's also something actually that some people have criticized. For example, this is actually Rahul and Matthias, they're part of Herbs, so we've been looking at the work of Herbs. Gita presented some of it because she's part of it, but we also looked at their user-based cities when we were looking at Dharavi. But so there is this idea basically of informality not having a form, which indeed they kind of comment on here. So they take it in, again, this questioning of when people say, now that many commentators have replaced the word slum with the phrase informal settlement, because that became the more kind of politically correct way of considering what previously had been called a slum. We are compelled to wonder, what do we really mean by the term informal? Do we mean unconventional, unofficial, unplanned, undesigned? Or do we mean its form is imperfect? It's like not fully formed. So without form, also in the sense of being kind of in emergence, in kind of, in even formless. Is it simply everything outside of the formal, in which case we start asking, what exactly is the formal? Is it really possible to conceive a pure formal settlement at work? Like a machine or a perfectly orchestrated system with no traces of what we call informal processes intrinsic to them? So, questions for you, which you might already have an answer to. But this formlessness comes hand to hand with this idea of an organic kind of city that in some cases is highly celebrated. I was talking about that hilltop medieval village, which actually, there are some scholars that have been doing morphological analysis, and they have shown that the morphologies of middle-aged Italian hilltop villages and Lebanese slums are actually very, very comparable from a morphological standpoint. But on the one hand, we have an image of something, and on the other hand, we're thinking of slums and so forth. So from the kind of formal morphological understanding, what are we actually talking about? And so that's kind of quite interesting to know. There also has been quite a lot of scholarships in saying, from every moment that we have tried to construct a formal city, And the case of Chandigarh is actually a kind of one of the cases that's been considered to describe this. Or even when there were formal Roman camps and so forth being laid out, there was always an informal settlement that was on the side of it, simply because these formal cities had to be built by somebody. And so in the case of Chandigarh, there were all these kind of labor colonies, and then they actually stayed on. They were supposed to be temporary, they were supposed to be provisional. So from the very beginning, even from the standpoint of the history of urban planning and town planning and so forth, we see that there's an immediate kind of connection. And it goes back to that statement by Erbs on, can anything be considered truly formal as a kind of standalone thing? And so it's also this whole idea that was accompanied, especially in the kind of heyday of modernism, where modernism was presented as the kind of language and the promise, where then there was a kind of direct dichotomy laid out between modernist housing and formless housing, makeshift housing, where you see there's a problem and then there's a solution. These are experts from Caracas, where there was a kind of crash, super intensive program of building, an incredible amount of modernist slabs, and they were all for eradicating insalubrious housing. So there's been a moment in time when this kind of dichotomy led to quite violent and problematic, in fact, situations in the construction, in fact, of cities. But one of the most clear, actually, biases that exists, and I've already heard it sometimes just by people in the class or phrasing questions or saying things, is that there is an assumption that usually if you're informal, you're actually doing something out of the law. That there's a sense of illegal kind of action in a certain sense. You're not supposed to be where you are. Yeah. Can you just speak a little? But in many institutional documents, there are entire areas that are occupied by informal settlements that are drawn as white, as if they were not there. So yes, they are there, but this kind of tension with the fact that you shouldn't be there means that there's always this kind of experience of not being there eventually, because from one day to the next, something can happen. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which is government property, that it's very contested in the city as well, because half the city is very much we need to support people that don't have what we have, and then the other half is feeling threatened by it. And it's quite interesting to see how the media then phrases how these evictions happen, because it happens so frequently that people just start assuming that people are not allowed
Mm-hmm.
to have shelter.
Yeah.
Which is quite an interesting tension where out of law becomes quite vague.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a really good example, and there's several others that go in that direction, and that it's actually precisely about that kind of pending sense of being illegal that allows also for these kind of actions also that they could happen from one day to the next. So there's a kind of tacit acceptance until a certain moment in time, that could be tomorrow, that could be today. And when you get your eviction notice, because of the fact that you shouldn't be there, you're not even entitled to the classic time frame of being able to relocate and so forth. So there's a lot of kind of implications with that. But this is where Ananya Roy has been particularly important, because in her paper and also in other studies she has done, she says, well, if we understand informality as actually a way of producing cities, so she says an idiom of urbanization, a logic through which differential spatial value is produced and managed, then she says urban informality cannot be restricted to the bounded space of the slum. It's actually a mode of production. And she says it's that same mode of production that operates in very different places of the city. But then it becomes a choice whether you criminalize certain parts of the city towards others. And that's really, it was kind of a moment really of great, let's say also importance for all the studies on informality, because she made it very clear, and she made it very clear in terms of this also study that she did on Mumbai's shopping malls, where she was showing that the way in which the malls were being produced was actually completely also out of law. So the same mechanisms of not considering a number of urban regulations were at hand. But because it was the redevelopment of malls and it was all part of a whole kind of transformation of Mumbai, nobody had anything to say about it. Well, nobody. It was kind of accepted as a formal mode of production, but actually it was not at all. If we shift our gaze and we consider informality as this way of producing cities that then produces differences between cities. It's a really crucial piece. Read it if you haven't. And so it's interesting because she says these forms of urban informality, from Delhi's farmhouses and Kolkata's new towns to Mumbai's shopping malls, are no more legal than the metonymic slum. So what we've always heralded as the kind of epitome of informality and so forth. And I realize we have to hurry up a bit. Anyhow, these are images, in fact, of these malls that she's kind of talking about, and also of housing, in fact, in Kolkata. So those are the new towns. So you would never consider these informal, right? But what she is saying is that they are, because of the way in which they were produced, and so forth. So what she says is, elite informalities are being protected and valorized, and subaltern formalities are being criminalized. And this takes us to the third point, and I'm going to have to accelerate a little bit. I'm sorry, but I realized I took too much time in the earlier slides, which is this kind of emphasis on the self-organized and the entrepreneurial, which also goes back to the idea that actually the first time informal was used was actually in the 70s by Keith Hart, who was investigating informal labor in Ghana. Well, he called it then informal labor, but he was pointing out to this kind of also economic practice and so forth. And so a lot of the texts that focus on entrepreneurialism are related to kind of also proving the economic value of these places. And Dharavi has been a key point in that regard as well. That's what Jan Nijman talks about. He actually describes, Dharavi's GDP in 2002 was estimated at about $360 million US. This has nothing to do with a kind of deprived neighborhood from that perspective and so forth. So it's really interesting to kind of see that. So that means that usually there's also a kind of culture that is being then celebrated and valorized. Rem Koolhaas did it for Lagos, this what he calls the culture of make-do, self-organization, creating intense emancipatory zones. So it has a very kind of liberating effect from all the negative kind of claims on particular sites, but it can also be accused in a certain sense of, however, framing everything to be celebrated as a form of economic kind of practice that still remains, however, in this frame of economic libertarianism. So all these kind of small entrepreneurs that at the same time they're contrasting these kind of dystopic descriptions, but at the same time it's very different from breaking away from being caught in the kind of libertarianism of economies and so forth. So again, every time we look at one of these points, we see that there are ambiguities within, and it's the same with the dispossessed and the voiceless. There's been a very important idea that informal life is also bare life. It's actually a way to keep a whole series of people in dire conditions with a kind of purpose in a certain sense, because in fact, Uprooted rural migrants, as Mike Davis says, informal workers have been dispossessed of their labor power. So there's the other side, in fact, of the spectrum with regard to the entrepreneurial perspective is this idea that, on the other hand, it's deliberately done to keep people at hand for very low wages and very kind of, and that's also why we can recognize a continuum and a proximity between high-end areas and informal settlements and so forth. So it becomes quite important. But this sense and this emphasis on dispossession is also about recovering the political agency of slum dwellers themselves. It's kind of moving that forward and saying, no, we are going to, there's voices that are there. So the voicelessness is it's more about promoting these voices rather than not. And that's also why there starts to be discussions around slums of hope and slums of despair. Slums of hope are the ones that, through entrepreneurialism and agency, can thrive, and they can be part of this incremental process of self-transformation, whereas the slums of despair are those who would not be able to do this because of a series of circumstances. They're kind of declining neighborhoods and so forth and so forth. These are examples of slums of despair, where there's severe deficiencies, where there's social breakdown, everyday violence, and so forth. But of course, this kind of focus also on agency also comes from the perspective of more and more slum dwellers are kind of mobilizing to be able to face and confront evictions and other kind of aspects that are then very easy to implement precisely because of their particular fragile kind of situation. So there's been, for example, a quite important movement called conscientious ethnography, which is saying, okay, it's not right that I speak for the subaltern, but at the same time, these voices need to be presented. So through this kind of ethnography, I'm going to be able to voice what is otherwise too ignored and too neglected and too dismissed. And another very important practice is that of enumeration. I don't know how many of you have heard about it, which is an act to counter eviction, because eviction often comes with saying there's too many people living here. And enumeration, or the other side is there's nobody living here on the map. It's white. So enumeration says we're going to count ourselves. We're going to say how many we are, where we are, so that no figures and no data can be used against us. We're going to self-produce it. And so there's been a very important a series of actions where it's actually the undocumented that are documenting themselves and so forth. And then the last point is about this whole question of adaptive and transitional kind of environments, which is quite important in that regard, and which also partially overlaps. But as I said, these are kind of porous categories, but it's a bit the kind of bias that's been set forth, is that we have to understand as cities and places as evolving in time. If we don't have that time-sensitive lens, we are going to be in trouble. And informal settlements are basically the best possible way to understand about this kind of adaptive transitional kind of power, which is actually also, there's something interesting to it. We can actually harness it because it's about being dynamic. It's about evolving kind of norms and standards and so forth. And it's also something that from the very beginning, already with John Turner, there was this emphasis on change, but also on change as something that's self-determined, a level, again, of agency. So the freedom to build. We are not invaders, but we are something different. There's this level of self-organization. So it's when self-organization is highly celebrated at the same time, but also as a kind of collective modality of producing cities, not just individual needs that are being met, but a kind of way of making cities through collective self-organized invasions, where then we have this adaptive system where the shack is a starting point. This is how a kind of informal city comes forward. And that's also why there have been researchers that have actually started saying we should actually learn from this. Informal urbanism is actually a form of understanding how alternatives and how transgression works. This is freedom, actually, that we should understand. Also, as for example, emancipating ourselves from property lines as being the only determinants of how cities work, especially in places where private property is basically a dominant everywhere. And so these kind of diagrams and perspectives are there in an idea of retrofitting particular areas where this kind of dynamism is at place, especially along the Mexican-US border at the time, and where then actually informality becomes something that informs urbanism. And so there would be much more to say about this, but what is also quite interesting to understand is that slums do evolve, and then the whole discussion is, if we look at a slum 50 years later, what kind of city do we see? This is just one image that shows how over several decades places have come to be. And so if we consider this adaptive dimension, do we really have to eradicate slums, or do we, on the other hand, have to support the process of adaptability and transitionality to then kind of allow them to become something that might not reach an end goal, because maybe there shouldn't be a fixed idea either. So there's this kind of debate that is ingrained within this. So again, just to kind of really, these are the last 3 slides. It's interesting because Ananya Roy says, let's use informality as a way to actually talk about relationships between the legal and the illegal, the legitimate and the illegitimate, the authorized and the unauthorized, and so forth. And also, as a working group of researchers that I was actually part of a while ago, there's this idea also that informality, it's not just growing. So yes, there is this idea of mega slum and mega city and so forth, but what is also growing is inequity. And so we have to actually understand and accept informality fully. We have to embrace it fully to actually be able to recognize that it's a heavy contributor under many different angles. So even if we take all the 5 kind of biases, entrepreneurialism, agency, and so forth, we will recognize that there are very interesting contributions coming from these sites. So rather than labeling them under the lack of this and lack of that, let's maybe try and understand it a little bit differently. And there's many people that have argued in favor of that, which is also why a very interesting threesome of women who have been working on this for a while also say, actually, we are arguing for a continuing focus on informality. So yes, the term is a problem, but we have to keep our attention on it. So they say, while the conceptual difficulties with this concept are well recognized, actually, it remains significant in understanding trends and patterns in urban development. So they argue in favor of using it only if we recognize that basically it's about a way to, and this is where we can kind of look at the last lines, to basically look at a whole series of systems and processes that are related also to marginalized groups within society. So if we kind of abandon the term, we might not be able to be as attentive to these kind of processes. And I'm going to leave you with this. I know it's a lot, and I'm sorry I had to run through, but again, we'll somehow get back to this in the context of the exams, the papers, and the next sessions.